Hey, welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's editor-in-chief, and I'm happy to be here with you today for How to Be Virtuous During an Election Cycle with Seth Segall. This is a Tricycle Premium event, and we hold these events monthly, but just for today, all are welcome. If you're not a premium subscriber and would like to attend events like this, you can subscribe at tricycle.org/subscribe or upgrade by accessing your account online or writing to support@tricycle.org. That might be the easiest option, support@tricycle.org to upgrade. Tricycle is a nonprofit, and if you'd like to learn more about our mission or donate to Tricycle, visit tricycle.org/donate. We'll be leaving time for questions at the end of this hour-long session. You can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So rather than use the chat, if you have a question, please use the Q&A tab where I'll see it. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. Today's Zoom session will be recorded. We'll share the replay link in a follow-up email. So those of you for whom this is very late or very early, you will get an email, although you're not here to hear this. My guest today is Seth Segall. Seth Zuihō Segall, PhD, is a Zen Buddhist priest and clinical psychologist who is the science writer for the Mindfulness Research Monthly, a contributing editor to Tricycle the Buddhist Review, and he leads the Pamsala Zen Center of Westchester. Seth has practiced Buddhism for over a quarter century. Since 2010, he has practiced in the White Plum Zen lineage and received clerical ordination in 2016 under the preceptorship of Daikin Nelson Roshi. He is the author of several books, including the newest, The House We Live In, Virtue, Wisdom, and Flourishing, which I recommend. I loved that book. In fact, I did a podcast with Seth about that. He is also the teacher of Tricycle's newest online course, The 7 Universal Virtues, which launched this week and is open to enrollment. A link to the registration page for this course can be found in the chat. So welcome, Seth.
Hi, it's good to see you again, James.
Good to see you. As you yourself acknowledge, a lot of people feel uncomfortable with the word virtue, and I even wondered about it in the title when we were first advertising this. For many, it sounds, as you say, prudish, stuffy, even old-fashioned. Can you tell us a bit about how you're using the word and why you felt it was important to?
Yeah, well, first of all, I sympathize with those people who feel that way about the word virtue. I think about back to the Victorian era when parents gave their young girls names like Prudence and Chastity, and it feels very old-fashioned to us. But I'm using it to refer to a concept that really developed over 2,000 years ago in a variety of different cultures. And if you look at Plato and Aristotle, or you look at the Buddha, or you look at Confucius and Mencius, they all used a concept like this. They had a different word for it. So the Greeks called it arete, and Buddhists call it paramita, and the Confucians called it de. We don't have a single word that encompasses all of that. But when the Romans came along, they translate this concept as virtue, and we get that word virtue from the Romans through the French. It kind of entered the English language around the 12th century. So, for example, you'll see the word in Chaucer, for example. But I think of it not in a kind of sense of sin versus virtue or good or evil, but I think about it in terms of a virtue is a character strength or a competency or I think competency is a good word for it. It's a skill, a set of skills that we develop and we cultivate over the course of a lifetime. And we do it because it leads to having a better life. It improves our personal lives and improves the lives of the people that we live with as well. So we're talking about character strengths like honesty or like fairness or like humaneness. We're talking about things like temperance and equanimity. These are all things that if we acquire them and build the skills to display them, our lives go better. But it's not as if we can become totally virtuous people. We're always, in any given moment, more or less virtuous, depending on the time of our life or the situation that we're in. These are competencies we have, but we don't always use them. Okay. And so remembering to use them, remembering to kind of use these strengths to develop is an important part of being a virtuous person. Um, so yeah, let's just talk about them as character strengths, and if you don't like the word virtue. But I use the word virtue because modern philosophers use it. They talk about the ancient ethics of Aristotle and the Buddha and Confucius as all being what they call virtue ethics. It's a kind of a hot term of use in current philosophy.
Hmm. Well, we're having this discussion in the middle of a hotly contested election cycle. What does it mean to be a virtuous person at this particular time? How would you see that?
Well, I want to say first of all that that the idea of democracy is a very, very central and important idea to my view about communal life. And I want to think about democracy not so much in terms of sets of institutions like the franchise or like balance of powers or free press, but I want to think about it as a set of attitudes that we bring to communal life. And this is the way the philosopher John Dewey understood it. That a democracy is a place where we care about the well-being of everyone, and we want everyone to develop their capacities and their abilities and thrive and develop a life that's meaningful and purposeful and good. We want everyone to be able to do that as much as possible. So it's a sense of we're all in this together and we're all trying to help each other in some kind of way. And if you're going to sustain a democracy, I think that these character strengths are absolutely crucial. We have to believe in fairness. We have to believe in being honest. We have to have the courage to stand up for ourselves. We have to have that sense of compassion and caring for other people. These are all skills that sustain communal life in a very real way. So when it comes to a hotly contested election, I think holding to those values, despite our passions and despite our anxieties and so forth, is crucial. This is the kind of community you want to build. One where people are fair, where they're courageous, where they care about each other and so forth. So that's the first thing I think about when I think about being virtuous during the election cycle. Hold on to those values that you think are really central to a good and purposeful and meaningful life, and try not to deviate from them.
Yeah, that's really the issue. How do we hold to those values at a time of such great disruption when we feel that the foundation of those values themselves are threatened? It would be, I don't think I could find a person who hasn't felt at times, I just have to fight and they drop everything. And so, what do you have to suggest to us about actually holding to those values, even when the institutions that support them feel threatened, at least from the point of view of many?
Well, first, I mean, I want to reflect a minute on mindfulness, okay? And I'm thinking about mindfulness not so much in the contemporary usage of paying attention to what's happening in the moment, although that's there, but I'm thinking it in the older kind of Theravadan sense of heedfulness or remembrance. In other words, in any given moment, it helps to kind of keep the whole teaching, the whole set of teachings in mind. What's our purpose? What are we here for? What are we trying to accomplish? What are the ways that get us there? And what are the ways that undermine us and defeat us? What are the ways that really lead to happiness? And what are the ones that lead to unhappiness? We're trying to kind of keep that whole sense in mind. And I think that's what we need to do when we fight. Well, what are we fighting for? We're fighting for people to have integrity and to be kind to each other and to be honest with each other. Well, we have to remember to be all those things if that's what we want to see in the end. So I think a lot of this is, it's easy to go with one's fears or one's passions and so forth, but instead try to keep in mind, what are we really trying to accomplish here? And if your actions are not consistent with the goal you're trying to reach, then you really are just undermining them. So do we have to fight? Of course we have to fight, but it depends on what you mean by fight. If fight means just being motivated by anger and hatred and fear, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be saying what's skillful in this moment, what really leads to a better outcome in some kind of way. And then, yes, we devote our full energy into that. We're not lackadaisical about it. But at the same time, we do it in ways that don't undercut what we're really trying to accomplish.
I was thinking maybe of James Carville. I saw him. He's a very colorful, entertaining
Yes.
figure. And he said, I'm just about winning. I want to win.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like we're doing what we need to do to win. And that's, of course, from his political perspective. But How
So
much?
yes, we want to win, but that means do what's effective in winning. And being effective means being effective in upholding the values you care about as well. You know, if you go ahead and demonize the other side and spread lies about them in order to win, then you're just contributing to the kind of society you really don't want to live in. You,
Mhm.
you know, be truthful. If we're going to hate the other side, is that the society we want to live in where people hate each other? No. I can disagree with you about your beliefs very strongly. And I certainly hope you lose the election, but it doesn't mean I have to hate you. It doesn't mean I give up my respect for you as a fellow human being in that process.
You
Once
know,
you do that, you become part of the problem.
I think the hardest thing, uh, if I consider trying to adhere to these values, trying to stay virtuous by your definition,
Mhm,
the hardest thing is when close friends or family hold views that you find repugnant.
mhm,
Uh, what do you have to say about that? Because it's not just somebody out there, it's somebody at your Thanksgiving table.
mhm. Well, I think it helps, first of all, to have some humility, to recognize that we're all fallible human beings, that every one of us believes some things that aren't true. Okay. And at some time in the future, we'll find out we believed some nonsense that we really shouldn't have believed. We all kind of, as we grow up, we change our views about things. So let's not believe that people who we label as good have to always be right about everything. They don't. And second of all, these people who have abhorrent views may be very fine people in other ways. They remember our children's birthdays. They're when we're sick, the kind to us. They come bring us chicken soup. I can remember when I was growing up in my household, which was a Jewish household, and we'd have these seders on Passover where the whole extended family would come in, and we'd have raucous arguments. You know, there's an old saying, you know, two Jews, three opinions. Everyone at the table was disagreeing and arguing about politics. I mean, Eisenhower was the president then, and then uh, there were all kinds of arguments and jokes about Eisenhower and so forth. And on the other side, jokes about Adlai Stevenson. And we all we actually had a good time, you know, at these arguments. I remember having a good feeling about the fact that we could all do that and remain friends when we were done afterwards. So I think that's a crucial thing to kind of remember that other people believe what they believe for all kinds of reasons. Okay, it's not that they're mean necessarily or stupid. Um, People have different beliefs if they grew up in a different religious community, or if they grew up in a different part of the country, if they're in a rural area as opposed to an urban area, if they grew up in an area which was multicultural versus one that was monocultural, you know. Um, so so people have different beliefs for all kinds of reasons, not because they can't think or they're evil in some kind of way. And you have to accept that. This is the way it is in the real world. There'll be a plurality of opinions. There'll be differences. And we don't have to agree, and we can even fight each other on the battlefield of the electoral, you know, in terms of voting and so forth. But it doesn't mean that we have to hate each other. And I can maintain the hope that one day you'll change your mind, you know, but that's just a hope. For example, I know that if I happen to be, you know, a liberal, and I happen to know that if a Trump supporter came up to me and began to give me all the reasons why I ought to be a Trump supporter, there's nothing in the world that he could say that would change my mind. Okay. And I have to understand that it's the same the other way around. That if you happen to be a Trump supporter, there's probably nothing I could say that would change your mind. So let's not try to change each other's minds. Let's try to have a conversation in which I understand you. I understand why you believe what you do and where you're coming from. I I can report back to you what you said, and you'd agree, yes, that's what I said. And then I can say, well, not here's why you're wrong, but here's why I see things differently. And then I can explain what my view is without any animus. You know, you can have that conversation with most people. You can't have that conversation with a sociopath or a narcissist or a Machiavelli. I mean, there's some people that are only interested in winning an argument and not interested in having a conversation. So if you see that a person is that kind of person, you don't engage with them, right? You just try to keep your distance and stay cool. But if you see a real human being in front of you, which is what 99% of human beings are, you know, then let's just agree to disagree. Let's share our viewpoints. Maybe there's even something I could learn from you, you know, that I didn't believe I could. And maybe there's something you can learn from me. And the fact of the matter is that it's not arguments that change people, but friendship that changes people. So in my book, I tell the story about a white supremacist, for example, who's the son of a major figure in the Ku Klux Klan, and he goes to college, and he meets Black people and Jewish people in his freshman class, and they have long discussions into the night about how they differ about things, and they don't change his mind, right? But after this goes on for a couple of years, he realizes these people are my friends, and he says, I don't want to hurt these people because they're my friends. And so he begins to moderate and change his views at that point, not because they convinced him he was wrong, but because he sees them as human and wants to kind of be in communion with them in some way. And that's why we change, really. We change out of, I think about that old story about the sun and the wind having a fight about who's stronger. And there's a man who's wearing a coat, and they're arguing about who can take the coat off the man. And the wind blows and blows and blows, and the man just takes, holds the coat tighter against him. But the sun comes out and warms him, and he says, oh, it's hot. And he takes the coat off. I think that's true. It's friendship that changes people, not argument.
It's funny. I know a few people who are voting differently from me. And I mean, I think we've agreed not to discuss it because sometimes it's not discussable. But ideally, we would have the sorts of discussions that you suggest. Another
Yeah,
part of the,
just the other day, I had a man come in to check my furnace. Okay, it was annual inspection of my furnace. And we had a conversation afterwards about all this, and he said, well, I listened to Trump, and some of the things he says sound reasonable. I listened to Kamala, and some of the things she says are reasonable. He says, I don't know how to vote, So we had a discussion afterwards, and he mentioned that sometimes Trump says things that are crazy. And I said, yeah, my advice is to vote for the person who's not crazy, even if you don't necessarily agree with everything. And, he left, he didn't have any clear idea about who he was going to vote for, but we left in a friendly way. He looked at my name on his iPhone. He said, "Oh, you wrote these books. How can I get them?" I mean, we had a friendship that started, even though we didn't agree about politics.
Before this conversation, I decided I'm going to start listening to all sorts of different news sources. And I do that sometimes anyway. I listen to news sources I disagree with, those I agree with. But there is something very salient in many of the broadcast news shows, and I feel that I'm being baited, or I feel that the intention is that I become outraged, and as outraged as they are. So how do we practice mindful and virtuous consumption of news? How to practice, say, temperance in the middle of it all? Because I was quite enervated after I watched this Spectrum. I watched too much, but I
Yeah.
don't usually watch that much. But I thought, what's it like to watch all of these news shows that represent views that I don't agree with at all? And on both right and left, I felt baited on a regular basis.
Well, we are. I mean, that's how you raise money in a political campaign, and money is the coin of the realm, right? I mean, you raise money by outraging people and getting them and motivate them. And certainly when you think about social media, it seems sometimes the main purpose of social media is both to kind of create outrage, and certainly the bots are trying to do that. And there are all kinds of malicious actors representing different organizations that are trying to stir up outrage. And there's a whole echo chamber and virtual signaling and everything that goes on there. So sometimes it's a terrible place to spend a lot of time. So the first thing I'd recommend is not to spend a lot of time on social media, period. Close your iPhone or your Android and go outside and notice that the weather is beautiful outside and there's still flowers outside, and walk out in nature and find some balance that way. The other thing is to recognize that, no matter whether you're listening to Fox News or MSNBC, people are trying to kind of stir you up in some kind of way, and you don't. Sometimes you will be stirred up, but I think you need to put things in a little bit of perspective. I guess there's a sense in which this election is an apocalypse. That things are never going to be the same afterwards. But I want to say the world has always been a horrible place in a lot of ways. I mean, there's always been injustice. There's always been one side is dominant and the other side is oppressed. There have always been wars. There have always been elites fighting each other for control. I read this incredible book last year. It was written in the 1930s by the Protestant theologian Ronald Niebuhr on It's called Moral Man and Immoral Society. I don't think I've read a book that's been more impactful than that book. But he says two things in that book. One is that no privileged group in society has ever voluntarily given up its privilege. That's the first rule he gives of history. The second rule is no minority in history has ever accepted the rule of the majority, except when there's been the threat of force or real force used. And he says that's just the nature of human beings in groups. They're horrible to each other, and they're all jockeying for their own power and trying to defeat each other. And it's been that way since the beginning of recorded history. Okay, so it's the aristocracy against the peasants, or it's the the banks against the farmers, or whatever you want to look, wherever you want to go. That's been the history of the world. So the fact that we're still in that mess, this world is unjust, unfair, unbalanced, run by power concerns. The fact that we're still in that world, that's the world. It's always going to be the world. It always has been the world. Despite that fact, the amazing thing is we are able to make progress in it. We're able to, within the last few hundred years, we were able to abolish slavery in the United States, although not prejudice. We've been able to grant women the vote, although women still aren't equal. We've been able to grant homosexuals the right to marry. Progress, very slow progress, does occur because people work at it steadily. But it doesn't take away the fact that we're never going to get to this place where there's this utopia. Okay, so let's suppose you're liberal like me and you really oppose the idea of Donald Trump getting elected, but maybe there's a 50-50 chance that he will get elected. What's going to happen? There's a tendency to want to go to our worst imaginations, that we're going to go from the Weimar Republic to the Third Reich in just a matter of weeks, that democracy will be ended. Could that happen? Sure, it could happen. It's ended many times, democracy. But that's not necessarily the most likely outcome of what's going to happen. Okay? Will Trump do lots of awful things in office? I think so. Okay? Will he succeed in totally destroying democracy? Probably not. Okay, he happens to be feckless. He happens to be reactive to whatever the issue is that moment that's affecting him and how he sees his own ego being affected. He doesn't really have a plan about how he wants things to be. He has aides that have plans. They have Project 2025, but he hasn't read that plan, and they will try to tell him what to do, but he never listens to anybody. So the odds that he'll actually totally destroy democracy, probably not, because we have a federal system, right? We have places like California and places like New York and places like Massachusetts that are going to remain liberal bastions no matter what Trump does. And there's always going to be a continuing fight. And we've seen in the past that there are countries that have gone from being autocracies to being democracies. I mean, you look at Taiwan, or you look at South Korea, or you look at Franco's Spain. There are a whole bunch of countries. You look at Poland recently, which veered towards autocracy and is now moving back to democracy again. There's always the possibility of recovering whatever you lose and regaining democracy. There's always the midterm elections in 2 years when Democrats can retake the House or retake the Senate or whatever they need to do. So I think we understand there's an ongoing fight that's always here. We're always in the midst of it, okay, to better the world in some kind of way. And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, and sometimes things look dark, but then we're able to recover from it. And I think that helps us keep our equanimity, to have this larger perspective. Okay, there isn't anything special about it now, with some exceptions. Okay, I mean, we have climate change, we have nuclear weapons. There can be worse outcomes now than there were in the past. Okay, but we live in precarity. That's the reality of our lives always. So there's a way in which one has to accept that one doesn't always get one's way, that the world is always a dangerous place, and that we just do the best we can. And the way we do the best we can is by cultivating these character strengths and living in accord with them.
It's interesting. I should acknowledge my bias is similar to yours. My political orientation is similar to yours. But both sides seem to feel a lot of anxiety, and both sides feel that they're losing their country, what's familiar to them. It's interesting how similar the language is. So you also mentioned that it's in many ways always been this way. People have always treated each other poorly, and yet there's progress. we could just as easily say samsara. This is samsara. It's not perfectible,
Yes,
and there is no utopia. In fact, utopians end up like Thomas More being cruel, you know. But how then do we deal with that anxiety and grief around current events without letting them overwhelm us or push us into despair, or to even tune out and say, that's samsara. I'm going to sit on my cushion, or I give up. This is overwhelming. I mean, that's the risk, isn't it?
it is the risk, but we don't give up because we always because as human beings, we always have aspirations for something beyond, for something more, for something better. I mean, we're always trying to better things. That's why we invent vaccines. That's why we study science. We're always imagining that life can go better for us in some kind of way, despite how awful it is, how awful history is, you know. So it doesn't make any sense to give up on it because we do make progress, you know. It takes a long time, though. I mean, the first person to talk about healthcare, universal healthcare for human beings, was Teddy Roosevelt, and then Woodrow Wilson, and it took from there to LBJ. You know, how many years passed before we had Medicare, and then how many more years before the Affordable Care Act. That's how change occurs: piecemeal, slow, one step forward, one step backward. I mean, how long did it take to end slavery in the United States, and then end Jim Crow, and then still dealing with the structural inequalities that are left over from all of that? It takes centuries to kind of correct wrongs. And is movement and progress always one directional and always better and better? No. I mean, we know that from experience. It's always like two steps forward and one step backward. Every every new idea that comes about is going to have a reactive reaction against it from people who don't want things to change. And there's always going to be a struggle back and forth until everyone agrees, or most everyone agrees.
You talk about the long arc, you see
Mhm.
progress. Um, and the question I have is how then to establish patience without attachment to outcome in our lifetimes. Maybe that we won't see what we want to see in our lifetimes. How to remain patient, how to maintain a sort of equanimity in the face of that.
Yeah, I don't think we should necessarily be patient, you know. I think why not put all, I mean, the reason that we ended slavery and the reason that women got the vote wasn't because people were patient. It was
Hmm.
because the suffragettes are out there marching. The abolitionists were out there. They were pouring their whole heart out into their work. So let's not be tepid or half-hearted about what we really care
Hmm.
about. You know,
But what
let's
about what about then attachment to outcome? Because we may not see it.
well, we care about that outcome. I don't even think we should not be attached to that outcome. I think we just have to
Hmm.
be accepting of the fact that you don't win every fight,
Hmm.
and that the process is a long-term process. It doesn't mean we be half-hearted about it, but say we want to deal with climate change right now. Okay, I mean, I care a good deal about it. I'm on my town committee that's changing zoning to permit more use of renewable energy. For example, have more electric charging stations, have more solar panels, have solar farms. I mean, we're working on this. That's my little way of working on it. And I have my own little solar panels on my own little electric car, and I try to be good in my own way about this. But I
Hmm.
also understand that there are coal miners who earn their money from that. There are people in Texas who earn their money from oil and gas. There are people in Pennsylvania who care about fracking because they're getting money from that. There are people in India who the temperature is 120 degrees and they would love to have air conditioning. You know, there are all these different people who have different, or somewhere else in terms of where they are in this position. And it may take 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 70 years to get most people on the same page about this. Now, do we have that much time? Not really. But that's the way human societies change, and you just have to be, I think you just have to be realistic about it. And you just say, listen, I'm doing the best I can. Am I doing everything I can that I reasonably can? Yeah, it has to be reasonable, right? Because I think about the poor children starving in somewhere else in this side of the world, and I can send them money, as charity, but I can't necessarily leave my family and run out there and try to help people, or I can't, I could, but I won't. I can't donate a kidney, sell a kidney and get the money from them and then send it to them. I mean, there are reasonable things to do and unreasonable things to do. But if I've done everything I reasonably can, given my life goals and circumstances and situations and talents, then you have to say, okay, I don't control the outcome. I just do the best I can. If we all do the best I can, maybe we'll have a good outcome, but it's never guaranteed. And we're attached to the outcome, but we're accepting of the fact that we don't control things, and we never do. I mean, that's the important thing to realize, that we're very limited in what each one of us can do. And we care about the outcome, but we can't control it. And when it doesn't go the way we want, we have to accept it and say, okay, well, what's the next thing I have to do?
Okay, I'd just like to remind everyone, you can post your questions for Seth in the Q&A as he and I are talking. The next question I'm going to ask you is about a virtue that you consider central to all of this, and that's benevolence.
Mhm.
And the question is, how do we stay benevolent when we feel anger after reading the news or speaking with people who have opposing views or views we consider toxic, say?
Mhm.
How do I still feel benevolence?
I think it's a good question. I think, again, it comes to that idea of mindfulness, heedfulness, the idea that we remember that that's really our intention in the world. It's what we really want to see manifest in the world. And if it's going to happen, it starts with us. Okay. If we contribute hate, we're just pouring fuel onto the fire. And as much as we may feel like, I really feel angry and I really hate what this person is doing, I think we need to kind of retain a sense that these people are still human, imperfectly flawed humans who have maybe crazy beliefs, but they're still humans. And they deserve the same respect, care, and dignity that all humans deserve. I mean, we believe that. I believe it, even when we're talking about people who commit terrible crimes and they're adjudicated and they go to jail. I don't think they should be treated with torture. I think that once you go to prison, you ought to be treated humanely, right? And I think that's true about all these people. Even if I wish they didn't have power, even if I see them as being manipulative and dangerous in all kinds of ways, they are still human beings that are reflecting their own conditions and circumstances that created them, you know.
So, what about trust? I mean, we've seen, how do we maintain trust in our institutions, in each other, when things get pretty chaotic and we feel that trust has been broken again and again? I mean, I think that's important, an important issue.
It's a wonderful question, and I've been thinking a little bit about that. If you look at surveys, opinion surveys, and you compare Americans to every other Western industrialized society, we are the most skeptical and untrusting of our institutions, whether it's not trusting the courts, or not trusting the press, or not trusting the clergy, or not trusting big pharma or medicine or science. We're the most distrustful of all of institutions in any industrialized Western country. And it's been getting worse and worse and worse over the last 30, 40 years. We've become more and more. And we're not only distrustful of institutions, we're distrustful of other people. So if you ask questions like, do you think other people will try to get advantage over you if they can, or take advantage of you, or try to trick you or fool you and steal stuff from you? Americans are more likely to say yes now than they did a generation ago, let's say. And I think this is crucial because society is really run on trust. You have to trust the various institutions. If they don't, if the trust begins to fail, then people just believe in conspiracy theories from there on in. The election really wasn't a real election. It was, as the Trumpians do, they say, well, he didn't really lose the election. You don't trust anything anymore. You don't believe anyone anymore. Anne Applebaum has written about how that's how totalitarian regimes work. It's not just they tell lies, but they tell so many different lies that people give up on the idea that there's any truth to discern, and they don't believe anything anymore. So the question is, how do you pull back from this brink of distrust that we have? And that's an awfully difficult question to answer. I don't have any special answer. I think it gets harder the more online we are, as opposed to the more person to person we are, because really, at least in my life, most of the people I meet are fairly trustworthy. They, in the important things, I don't really feel most people that I know are trying to trick me or fool me or take advantage of me or undermine me. That's not been my experience in life. It may be my experience online, but not among real people. So I think we have to learn how to learn to live with the internet, which is a kind of a new part of our lives that's really kind of disturbing our sense of trust in things. The other side is, I think, political scientists talk about affective polarization. The fact that liberals and conservatives not only disagree with each other, but don't like each other anymore. So, for example, if you look at the intermarriage rate between Republicans and Democrats, it's dropped below 4%. It used to be around 9% just a few years ago. So we don't want to be with each other. We moved to opposite sides of the state so we don't have to see each other. How do we get over that? And I don't have an easy answer for that. But I think the only answer is we have to start trying to kind of humanize each other. We have to avoid language that demonizes each other. We have to try to understand that, okay, we have differences, you work them out. I mean, some differences we managed to work out peacefully. I mean, for example, the Mormons, when Utah entered the Union, they believed in plural marriage. The U.S. government didn't. There was a fight over that. Somehow, we don't fight about that so much anymore. We've moved on from that. I think there are a lot of things we used to fight about, whether women could have the vote. We fought about that terribly for about 40 years. Okay, it's not something we fight over anymore. We fought a civil war over slavery, right? 750,000 combatants lost their lives over that. We don't fight about slavery anymore. We've moved on. We've moved on in some kind of way. We have to find some way not to demonize each other, but still keep each other human in each other's eyes. And I think that's a very hard thing to do, but I think that's our job, our most fundamental job.
I have to say, just a comment, I'm a little bit shocked to hear that we're the most skeptical. I hadn't realized that, but when I was young, I was in school in Europe, and we Americans were always considered too credulous. And
We were. I mean, I think
I don't know what's happened,
in
Well,
some ways, we were too trusting in the past.
Mhm.
We were trusting that my country, right or wrong, we were always right. We were always a force for good in the world during the Cold War, at least the way most people looked at it. The courts, there was a lot of deference in the courts, a lot of deference to physicians that isn't there anymore.
Right.
I remember aspiring to be a scientist when I was, a youngster and a teenager. I was going to become a biologist and so forth. And the respect for science was just enormous. It's not quite there in the same way anymore. In some ways, that's a good thing. It's good to be a little bit distrustful, a little bit skeptical and question. But it's not okay if you lose all trust in other human beings altogether and begin to think that everyone is lying to you all the time. I don't think that's true either.
It also makes compassion difficult if you don't trust people. So you talk about compassion, and I wonder, especially at a time like this, how do we remember that it should be given freely?
Mm. Well, first of all, let's take the word should out of that. Like it should be given freely. I mean, that sounds like let's just say that your life goes better when you're compassionate. You feel better inside, open, warm. Other people respond to you more when they see that you're compassionate. They want to be there for you when you're struggling. They care more about you. They like being around you. I mean, there are all kinds of good things from being compassionate. So try to hold that in mind, that this is what I aspire to be. This is what really makes my life blossom and bloom and go better. And not because I should, because it's the moral thing to do, but because it's the sane thing to do.
Okay, well, then I'll say, how do we remember that it can be given freely?
How do you do it? That's what practice is all about, isn't it? Trying to keep things in remembrance. I mean, mindfulness is probably the most important thing in Buddhism, because you're trying to keep mindful of the teachings. And it's the same thing in Socrates and Plato. He talks about temperance, and temperance for him really means knowing what you're really about, what your life project is really about, and keeping it in mind so that when you're tempted to do something that's going to screw everything up, you don't do it, because these are really my goals. These are the things that really make me happy. So how do you keep that in mind? It's hard to, because our society, there are a lot of forces in society trying to undermine that. So if you look at what Hollywood or TV or advertising tells you makes you happy, okay, it's about consuming more and owning more and winning. I mean, you get those messages all the time that that's really what makes you happy. But research shows it's really not what makes people happy. Okay, People who value wealth and beauty, for example, more than anything else, or popularity, they're less happy than people who value integrity and honesty and compassion. Um, I've, I've, I saw this study years ago, and I've just seen it recently reconfirmed, that you look at college students and they have them keep diaries about what they're doing over the course of a couple of weeks. And they're keeping diaries of compassionate and humane activities, that are virtuous activities, and activities that are selfish. So selfish one might be, I bought myself some jewelry, or I went to a party and got high, or I masturbated last night, or whatever. Those are the selfish ones, self-oriented ones. And then the compassionate ones are, I helped a friend in need, or I had this deep conversation with someone, or I studied hard for a test, or I gave to a charity. And then you look at how they feel at the end of a month. And the more virtuous activities they do, the better they feel. They feel happier. They have a more positive evaluation of themselves and their lives. They think their lives are going in the right direction. And the more of the selfish, self-indulgent activities they engage in, it doesn't affect their happiness at all. In fact, it has a very slight negative correlation with happiness. So the answer is, this is what really makes people happy. Being members of community, helping other members of the community, helping your family, helping your friends, okay, bettering yourself in some kind of way. This is what really makes you happy in life, not getting a new piece of jewelry or getting a bigger car. I mean, these things help. I mean, I don't have anything against, making a little bit more money or having a better car. Those are fine, but in the end, they're really not what makes you happy.
Why do you think we so misunderstand what will make us happy?
Uh, well, I mean, part of it has to do with the whole economic structure in the world today. I mean, you make money by producing and selling products and advertising and selling them to them and convincing them that's what they really need. You need a whole body deodorant in order to be happy and so forth. That's whatever it is. So, I mean, that's why we get these messages all the time. It helps the economy keep on running. But there's also the sense of popularity, of who are the popular figures in pop music or in sports, for example, and are these admirable people? Well, sometimes they are, but a lot of times they're not. A lot of times they're terrible human beings, and yet there's something cool about them or something transgressive about them that makes them makes you interested in them. So this is the kind of Kardashian society, right, where somebody who doesn't have any particular talent becomes very, very popular, and people want to be like them in some kind of way, as if it's going to make them happy.
Mhm. I guess it comes down to anger, greed, and delusion, maybe.
Always the
Yeah,
three
yeah.
points.
So I'd like to get to our listeners' questions. Alex Eldridge asks, what is the best way to approach people who believe things that we know to be lies?
Well, I think the best thing to do, first of all, you have to ask yourself, is it really important that I counter this lie right now? I mean, how important is that in my life and in my relationship with this person and so forth? I mean, we don't always have to tell the truth to everyone about what we think about them all the time. That could make life pretty unpleasant. So first of all, I would make an assessment. Is it really important that I address this with this person? If this person continues to believe this lie, is that going to be really harmful in some kind of way? Or is it just innocuous, and can I just allow them to go on believing that? But let's say they're a friend and we really care about them and we think it's important. I think the thing to say is, I have different, I hear what you're saying. I have different sources of information, okay, than you have. Let's see if we can do some research together and see whether my opinion, your opinion is right. Is there anything out there we can find? What are the facts that back up, or supposed facts that back up your opinion? What are the ones that are mine? Let's investigate this together and see what we can discover. I think I would offer an invitation to investigate, rather than just saying you're wrong, period. That's it. Believe me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, most people aren't willing to do that, by the way. I mean, you could reach a point where a friend of mine who had grown up in Canada was talking about the Canadian health system to some American who thought that the Canadian health system was terrible socialism, that people were dying all over Canada because of it. And he began to give facts and figures, about how healthy the Canadians were and how well the system was working. And finally, this woman said to him, "Well, I'm sorry, I just can't go there." She said, I can't. All right, well, you have to accept that at that point. She can't go there, at least not today, not now. People have all kinds of reasons why. If I go ahead and believe with you, it means I'll be on the out group with all my other friends in my social group, and I don't want to be an outlier in that group or something like that. So people have their reasons. But I think all I could do to somebody is say, let's investigate this together, and if they're willing to, if they're willing to.
Okay, Jim Tobin asks, can you speak about the concept of satyagraha and ahimsa employed by Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., and how it might serve as a template for us going forward in our efforts to defend democracy?
Ah, good question. I think you have to realize, first of all, something. Well, let me just say this. I think that the method of nonviolent resistance is often the best method to use, and it worked very well for Gandhi, and it worked very well for Dr. King. But you have to remember, it's a kind of force that you're using in a way, the force of great numbers of people coming out again and again and shaming the other person for their own behaviors in a way. But it's a kind of force that generates less resentment than physical force or violence does. Okay, if I use nonviolent resistance to resist someone else, they'll be angry at me for doing that, but they won't be quite as angry and alienated as they would be if I used violence to try to put forth my plan. So I think for that reason, nonviolent resistance is a wonderful method going forward. But I think it works in some areas and not in others. You have to be careful where it's going to work. For example, it worked well against the British in India because the British actually had a conscience about what was going on. It wouldn't have worked very well against, say, the Nazis. You know, you have to think about where it's effective and where it isn't. It worked well for Dr. King, I think, because all those pictures that we saw in the 60s in the newspapers and television of dogs being sicked on people and fire hoses being sicked on people who weren't violent at all, but were just trying to sit at a lunch counter or sit on the bus. I think it affected the conscience of a great deal of America at that point. People felt they had to do something, so it was very effective there. But you have to have an opponent who has a conscience that's ready to be motivated for it to be effective. So that's all I want to say about it. I think in that book that I talked about earlier by Reinhold Niebuhr that was written in the 30s, he talks about Gandhi at that point, and he sees it as maybe the only way to move forward against oppressive forces in a way that can really be effective. So I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's effective, but I think it's not always effective. So that's all I'll say.
You know, I don't know exactly how this relates, but I remember before the Iraq War, tens of thousands of people marched up Fifth Avenue, and in Queens, they didn't even know that they had marched, and nothing came of it. So I suppose, though, the persistence and then the reference back to that point, there were people of conscience who did oppose it, and that makes a difference, I think, in retrospect, at least, in
Well,
talking about it.
that's an interesting question. I organized the first anti-war protest against the Vietnam War at my college back in 1964. And all throughout the Vietnam War, I was demonstrating at the Pentagon, I was going to Washington, I was demonstrating in my local community, writing letters to the editor. I mean, I did everything I could. And the same thing with the Iraq War. I was out there in the streets at that point too. But the interesting thing is, I don't think our efforts against the Vietnam War shortened the war by one day.
Mm.
That was in 1964. I can't remember when the war ended. Was it in 70?
73, I think, or 72.
So it
73,
went
I
on for
think.
another 10 years despite all that. So I think it was important that we did it, that we tried to create a kind of moral center around that might draw more people in, but I don't think we necessarily succeeded at it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing with the Iraq War. We didn't end, I mean, that war went on for 20 years, you know,
Right.
And nearly 1 million people were killed by the time it was done. If you include the battle with ISIS afterwards, all the consequences that came from it. I think it was important we were there in the streets. I'm glad we did it. On the other hand, you don't always change power relations by doing that. So
Right. Okay, an anonymous attendee asks, how can we encourage those on the other side from us politically reciprocate this compassion and goodwill while being clear that we disagree?
Well, I know there are organizations going around trying to do this. I think about Better Angels, for example, which tries to hold conversations between people who disagree with each other politically and tries to keep them uh, uh, um, calm, reasonable, compassionate conversations. Not necessarily with the idea of changing people's minds, but with the idea that we still have to live together, even though we disagree with each other. I think efforts like that are good. I think being able to have conversations with people we know that we disagree with and try to keep them civil and try to say, well, I guess we disagree, but I still think you're a decent human being. I hope you still think that about me. I think having those conversations, every conversation we have like that, I think helps a little bit. It can only help so much, but it helps a little bit. I think that's what we aim for, to have those kinds of conversations. And when we want to lose our temper and yell at somebody else, remembering mindfulness, remembering to take a breath, remembering don't get your ego involved in this because it's not about your ego, and remembering we're just having a conversation.
For our listeners, we did interview the people from Better Angels in the magazine. So it's an interesting thing to look up if you're a subscriber to Tricycle, or even if you're not. So uh, a little pitch there.
Yes.
From Marie, we hear, do you have suggestions on where we can find unbiased sources of research and information, I would suppose?
Well, there are no unbiased sources, are there? Uh, everybody has. I mean, I think as a scientist, someone who's conducted research, you go into research and you have something you're hoping to find. You always have your own beliefs, your own biases, and so forth. We're seeing how much research, for example, right now is unreplicable. People people publish something and a lot of articles are retracted in scientific papers because of researchers' biases and so forth. They haven't been 100% fair. Um, I don't think there's any absolutely unbiased source of information. Um, I think the best thing to do is to try to read different sources. People have different perspectives on things, and um, and try to listen to as many sides as possible. And then you make up your mind. One of them seems more credible to me. And we have certain criteria, right, that we developed over the last couple of thousand years about how to decide when a source is credible and when it isn't, when it seems biased and when it isn't, when the facts seem to back up in one way and when they don't. We have all kinds of rules of logic that kind of help us do that. And I think we have to be what I call responsible epistemological agents. We have to kind of use all those tools as much as we can in evaluating what we see and what we hear. But I mean, obviously, some sources are going to be a little bit better than others. Okay, so but to say that, for example, the mainstream journals like the New York Times or the Washington Post don't have their own biases or own motivations for publishing what they do, that's nonsense. We're all human beings, and we all have a multiplicity of often conflicting motives about why we do what we do. Um, but still, I would say that I don't want to say that nobody has any credibility in all this. I would still rather read a scientific journal than a popular magazine, as a source of information about science. I would still rather listen to a group of scientists discuss a topic than a group of laymen. I'd rather listen to a doctor about healthcare than Robert Kennedy Jr. I mean, some sources are just more reputable than others, and they have more expertise, and we listen to them, but that doesn't mean that they're unbiased. I mean, there's never anyone who's totally unbiased.
Okay, one last question, and I'll
Mhm.
take a quick stab at it before I give you the question. How do we work at being better people when things are falling apart? So one suggestion I have is taking Seth's course, but that's pretty self-serving on on my part. But Seth, why don't you say something about that, and then we can wrap up.
Well, I want to say that things are always falling apart. And if they're getting better, they're just barely getting better. And only, that's just life. We live with precarity, we live with danger. Things are always having to be taken care of. If everything always needs painting or feeding, it's just maintaining things as they are takes as much work as we can, and making them a little bit better takes even more work. I think we have to just accept that that is our life. I loved it when Suzuki Roshi talked about human life, and he says, living your life is like setting out into an ocean in a little boat and knowing that in the end you will sink. I mean, there's a great deal of truth to that. There's no safe harbor or safe haven. There's just the only safe haven we have is our own integrity, our own willingness to do the best we can. And in Zen, we say that Suzuki Roshi said that Zen is doing your very best on the moment, moment after moment after moment after moment. That's all we can do. We can't make things work the way we want them to do. We can just do our best. And then there's a way in which we have to be content. If we can actually say we've done our best in this moment, then we have to be content with that in some kind of way, find a degree of contentment with it.
Okay, thank you, Seth, and thanks everyone for joining us. If you'd like to further explore what it means to be a virtuous person, be sure to check out our newest course featuring Seth called The 7 Universal Virtues. A link to the registration page for this course can be found in the chat. Again, Tricycle is a nonprofit. If you'd like to donate, please visit tricycle.com/donate or tricycle.org/donate. If you enjoyed this event and want more monthly conversations with Buddhist teachers and thinkers, visit tricycle.org/subscribe to become a premium subscriber, or write us at support@tricycle.org to upgrade your existing subscription. So thanks again, Seth, and thank you, everybody. We hope to see you again soon. And I should also mention, pick up Seth's book. You can find it on Amazon. Seth, what's the title again? I don't remember.
Oh no, you're going to ask me the title of my book?
I know. I did a whole podcast with you about it, which people can listen to for free.
It's called The House We Live In: Virtue, Wisdom, and Pluralism.
Okay, so that's a great book. You can also listen to the podcast I did with Seth. So thank you, Seth. It's great seeing you again.
Good seeing you, James.